Today's been the shame game. The Labor Party, the report came out. Now, they say there was a first draft, there's a second draft. Boy, the first one must have been tough, because this one, Annika, was pretty brutal.
Yeah, look, I think there's often a risk with some of these reviews that they don't actually reveal anything, and that's just sort of an exercise that parties go through after an election. Back in 2016, when Bill Shorten lost that, the report was actually never released. So it is a sort of break in a change in precedent to release it. But I think it's quite important. When you lose such an unlosable election as it has been branded, I think the party really does have to have a process where they, there's warts and all, as it's talked about, and they've split the blame a lot of ways. There was, talk that it would just all be at Bill Shorten, but they also said there was a clogged media message, that there was too many policies. So there's a lot of different reasons. They lost a lot of low-income voters, and I guess the only way that a party can expect to come back and win in a couple of years at the next election is to actually go through this process and, learn from it.
Yeah, see, Matt, the problem here, though, is because the Labor Party got their national convention, etc., they can't just ditch all their policies overnight. There'll be infighting in the shadow cabinet and elsewhere in caucus. Because, I mean, when the Libs got done over work choices, they came back afterwards, had their meeting and dumped it. But I can't see that they're suddenly going to dump franking or something like that, or dump their other policies.
Well, certainly the senior Victorian Liberal figure, Michael Kroger, made a point this afternoon on Sky of saying that after their disastrous 2007 election result, they very quickly dumped work choices. Though as explained, is as you mentioned, the whole Labor Party policy platform is something that there's a lot of party member involvement in. It's not something that's quite as easy for them to do. What they're seeking to do, from what I understand, is to try and put the context around the policies, what went wrong with those policies. So then it's up to the caucus, up to the Labor membership, to then pick and choose what went wrong, why it went wrong, what policies are going to work. It might be more painful for them in the short term, but in terms of giving them a chance to move forward together as a party with a little bit less infighting, this is probably the way they're going to be going.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it is fascinating. I mean, Annika, Bill Shorten did take it on the chin a bit, and they were saying quite brutally that we did have an unpopular leader. One part with the commentators today I'm a bit puzzled by. People saying, well, they didn't have some sort of election committee, they didn't have an action committee, but they had their leadership group, which I'm sure met in presence or by phone every day, and that would be a pretty powerful election committee, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it seems that perhaps some of the processes, I guess, weren't in place, which is surprising given, how they went in the 2016 campaign. But it did point to issues where either the leader and his office knew about certain policy announcements where that might not have necessarily been the case with head office, that there wasn't that same level of communication. And even their language around Bill Shorten was quite tricky. They didn't sort of say he was terribly unpopular. They just said he constantly had a, minus 20 approval rating, and it didn't sort of, move from there. But obviously Bill Shorten was anticipating this. I understand he actually was given a copy of this earlier in the day, and he did, just before it was released publicly, put out a statement saying the things he had learned, and this, of course, comes after he's already done his sort of mea culpa interview that a lot of sort of senior Labor figures have done recently. But he did point to, things he would have done differently, including, bigger tax breaks, and he said before around franking credits, I guess it was about explaining the policy more, and he really said he underestimated the, I guess, anger that older Australians had towards that policy.
Yeah, look, I had the argument way back during the election campaign. I said, taking something away from somebody, whether you agreed with the franking credits or not, taking something away from somebody that they've already had, it's very hard to do. And I said that I reckon the election was lost on Mother's Day, the week before the election, when they all went off to mums, the three generations, kids and kids, some of the three of them generations voting, mum and the grandchildren, grandkids and the kids. And they said, oh, we only got like $5,000, but they can take it away from me, and that was going to pay for our holiday to Melbourne, etc., etc. And that did not go down well, whether you agree with franking credits or not, no matter what it costs us. One other thing, Matt, what do you think... Sorry, Annika?
I think any policy where you don't, there has been criticism around not grandfathering it, or it's the same with a lot of the changes, that it was just the full change, immediately taking things away, not sort of tapering them off, or, they made people feel who had done, for at that time legal tax breaks, whether that be negative gearing or franking credits, that, they were actually doing something wrong. And I think it was just, as Matt said, a lot of it was actually around the language of how they sold this. And that's why they might not necessarily dump them going into the next election, but they'll really have to rework a lot of it.
Well, the Libs calling it a retirees tax was wrong but very clever. Now, Matt, what about the argument that's floating around today that our problem was we launched the whole election campaign for the last year to knock off Malcolm Turnbull, and then he wasn't there, it became Scott Morrison. Do you think that washes?
Well, as one wag in the gallery put it, they were preparing for a gentleman's duel with Malcolm Turnbull, each walking 10 paces and turning around and shooting. And instead they ended up with a street fighter and a bit of a brawler in Scott Morrison. They didn't have any attacks lined up. They ran a very positive sort of campaign without any real idea on how to challenge Scott Morrison. So when he came out there with a completely different tactic, they didn't adjust. They weren't quick on their feet to try and target him, to dig up dirt, like the Labor Party is often quite good at. Well, both sides are really quite skilled at that these days. So it certainly is plausible. I think it was a big flaw in their campaign, and I don't think there's too many people in the party who would disagree at this point.
Yeah, Annika, when you get even the Peter Creditors calling him Mr. Harbourside Mansion and Shorten referring every speech to the top end of town, suddenly you got a Prime Minister who's all beer and skittles, a beer and a meat pie at the footy, the bloke from the Shire. It bit and a bit hard, didn't it?
Absolutely. I remember when I was on the campaign, I asked Bill Shorten, he'd been up against 3 leaders by that stage, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison, about who was the sort of hardest candidate. And he didn't admit that Scott Morrison was a tough candidate, but I think he didn't expect him to come out swinging quite that hard. But I find that interesting because back in 2016, Labor, of course, were accused of many dirty tactics with Mediscare. And the problem with the Liberals, even though they got across the line, they all said that they didn't play the man hard enough in Bill Shorten and were adamant that they were going to do it this time around. So there was warning within Labor that they knew that they weren't going to be, as much as genteel as perhaps they had been in 2016. And I think even should Malcolm Turnbull have still been there, he would have gone harder that time around than he did in 2016 because they learnt from that. But having been on both campaigns out on the road, I think it just lacked energy to the Labor campaign. And I'm not saying I thought they were going to win. I didn't predict this. But, reflecting on, the momentum of the campaign out there on the Bill Shorten's campaign compared to Scott Morrison's, and speaking with my colleagues, there was a lot of energy around Scott Morrison's campaign.
After 2016, I actually asked Malcolm Turnbull, why didn't you go harder on Bill Shorten personally? And he virtually agreed they should have, but it was obviously it was a campaign decision. But this time around, you had, and I won't forget this one, it's indicative of the campaign. You had Morrison was in Queensland on the last day, and he decided at the last minute, go to Tasmania. He thought he could smell a few more votes, and he did. So he changed his plans, didn't go home to Sydney, went down to Tassie, and was still campaigning like his life depended on it on the Saturday of election day.
Yeah, and there's even thought that should a Liberal candidate down there, I think in the seat of Lyons, had not got in trouble with some tweets, that perhaps they would have even picked up another seat down there. And the report really said, Bill Shorten was particularly unpopular in places like Queensland, WA, Tasmania, and that's, of course, where the Liberal Party did quite well and where Labor didn't do so well.